Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Over the last 150 years, global demand for energy has been on the rise. It has risen hugely, together with industrial development and population growth. And the need for energy looks set to continue to rise. Predictions show us that the global need for energy may increase by as much as 50% over the next 20 years, as developing countries such as China and India try to fuel their own economic growth and catch up with the developed world. Now, as you probably know, the lion's share of our energy, of the energy that we use around the world, comes from fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas. But as you also know, these fossil fuels pose a great threat to our environment, and they are also non-renewable, so we will not be able to continue to use them into the future. Therefore, if we want to continue our current lifestyle and our current level of development, while also protecting the world against the impacts of climate change, we need to look to safer and more reliable sources of energy. Now, some people say that these safe and reliable energy should come from nuclear power, because, or so they say, nuclear is the best and the cheapest alternative to coal. Proponents of nuclear power sell nuclear as a clean energy solution because they say that it produces fewer carbon emissions than energy fueled by coal. Now, this may be true on some levels. It is true that energy produced from nuclear power produces fewer emissions than coal-fueled energy. However, such arguments also ignore the dangers that are inherent in nuclear power, so particularly the dangers to human health and to our environment. We don't need to go back very far to see for ourselves the dangers of nuclear power. In 1986, the huge nuclear disaster at Chernobyl came at a huge human cost. The lowest estimates say that the disaster at Chernobyl caused 4,000 deaths, but many say that this is a gross underestimation, and some people put the death toll at as much as 985,000. And the site, the area around Chernobyl, remains radioactive to this day. Now, nuclear proponents will tell you that things have changed since Chernobyl, that the technology has improved, that safety measures have been further developed. But then we look at just a few years ago, in 2011, there was another huge nuclear disaster at the Fukushima power plant in Japan. And given that we are still seeing the effects of Chernobyl 30 years on, it will be a long time, it will be decades before we know the true impact of Fukushima. However, I would like to leave these such arguments aside, because I know that arguments about the human risks and the environmental risks of nuclear power do very little to persuade nuclear proponents. So I want to look at the issue from a different aspect. Because when we really examine the reality of nuclear power, we can see that it simply is not feasible. And I will examine the issue from a number of angles. First of all, there are simply not enough sites in the world for us to really introduce nuclear power as an alternative to fossil fuel. At the moment, there are some 430 nuclear power plants around the world. If we want to replace fossil fuels with nuclear power, however, we would need to increase the number of nuclear power plants from 430 to 17,000. So this is a huge increase. And there are simply not enough sites in the world that would be suitable for such an increase. And this is due to a number of reasons. First of all, nuclear power plants or nuclear reactors create a great deal of heat, and they need to therefore be built next to a source of water in order to cool down the reactors. But this source of water is not always easily found. Furthermore, climate change and extreme weather events are putting this this source of water further, even more at risk. To give you an example, in the summer of 2008, the United States suffered from severe drought, and this led to the closure of around 20 nuclear power plants because there simply wasn't enough water to cool the reactors. To give a similar example, in 2012, a number of power plants, again in the United States, had to be closed down because the seawater that was usually used to cool down the reactors was simply too warm to do the job. And it's not just water. Nuclear power plants also need to be built away from areas that are at risk of natural disasters such as hurricanes, flooding or earthquakes, because all of these could provoke a nuclear disaster. Aside from these factors, some communities simply don't want to run the risk of allowing a nuclear power plant to be built in their area, so this further reduces sites or feasible sites. And there are also whole regions around the world that are off limits for the building of nuclear power plants because of political instability and the risks, therefore, of nuclear proliferation. So therefore, due to geography, due to local politics, due to global political instability, and due to climate change itself in the form of drought and other extreme weather extreme weather events, there are simply not enough sites for a nuclear power strategy on the level that would be required to use nuclear as an alternative to fossil fuels. My next argument is that nuclear power is unfeasible because of the dwindling uranium supplies around the world. So we know that fossil fuels are running out, but so, in fact, is uranium. Let us imagine that we have enough sites to build these 17,000 nuclear power plants. The uranium that we currently have, the uranium supplies that we currently have, look set to last us for around 200 years. If we increase, however, the number of power plants to 17,000, there will be a greater demand on the uranium supplies and they will therefore run out more quickly. And there are two knock-on effects of this. First of all, nuclear power producers would start to use a lower grade of uranium. And in turn, this would cause an increase in carbon emissions. Now, if we're thinking of using nuclear power as a strategy to reduce carbon emissions from coal, it seems ironic that the use of lower grade uranium would therefore, in fact, increase carbon emissions. Furthermore, as nuclear power producers need to access more uranium, they would start mining in areas that are less easy to reach in order to increase their uranium resources, which would cause hugely catastrophic effects both on the environment and the community. But not only this, it would also mean that in the effort to mine these more difficult to find uranium, power plants would be using more energy, more power in the mining and the processing of the uranium than they actually produce in the nuclear reaction itself. So therefore, we would be actually producing negative energy in the process. Last but not least, I want to look at the financial aspect because this is another area in which nuclear power simply is not feasible. Some forms of energy production, such as solar energy, have decreasing costs to scale. And what I mean by this is that the more solar panels that you build, the lower your costs become in the long run. However, when we look at nuclear power, as the number of viable sites and as the uranium supplies decrease, every single new nuclear power plant that is built will see rising costs. Even now, when we look at the new power plants that are being built, we see huge overspending in terms of their budget. To give you just one example out of many, one new generation power plant in Finland is already seeing a 25% overspend on its budget of $4 billion. Now, this money that is spent on nuclear power, a form of power that is very risky and non-sustainable, would be much more wisely invested in safer and cleaner energy sources such as solar power and wind power. So, to conclude, even if we discount the dangers, the risks, the drawbacks of nuclear power, it's still not feasible as a solution to climate change. Climate change is upon us. It is here, it is now. And if we want to reduce the devastating effects of this climate change, we need to launch a huge climate change offensive immediately. Given that for nuclear power to be a viable alternative to coal, we need 17,000 power plants, we can see that there is simply not the time to make nuclear a feasible alternative. When we add to this the risks to humans, to the environment, I fail to see why anybody would want to take that risk when we already have clean, renewable and safe energy sources at our fingertips. Thank you.